Hi and welcome back. So in this section we're going to take the tasks, the questionnaires, all of the different elements, and we're going to build them in the experiment and put that experiment online. So you'll remember from the first part we mentioned there were 4 conditions in this experiment. We had the factor of who you're paying attention to, which could be either the men or the women's conversation, and we had the factor of the audio channels, were the women on the left and the men on the right, or vice versa. So this gives us the 4 conditions, which we can see here. Women left, women right, men left, and men right. So as I mentioned in the last video, the way that I decided to do this was create a version of the task and then clone it and make my tweaks so everything is static. But there's no reason that you couldn't, for example, have one version of the task and use a spreadsheet or a manipulation to change the audio file or to change the text to say who you should pay attention to. There are lots of different ways you can do this, and if you want to clone my task and adapt it, I'd love to hear from you about that. Let's go through, this is the final example of what I created. You can see that obviously I've fleshed it out much more than the version that we did during the demonstration earlier. So the instructions, rather than just saying do this task, and I think I copy and paste one line from the actual paper, and now we've got something that's very fleshed out and tells people what they need to do. I've also added this section called check, which is kind of like the familiarize section that I wrote in the last tutorial. In this section we have that tone which goes on the right, and we just ask people here, could you hear the tone? Because we don't want people to start the experiment and not have any sound. So it's a useful check from that point of view. We also have a little check here to say, did you hear the tone on the left or right? And I engineered it so this tone is on the left, it's on the right. If you are wearing headphones, then that should be absolutely obvious. But if you're not wearing headphones, then you won't be able to tell that from the speaker on its own. And this could be a way of us to help us screen out participants that aren't listening through headphones, because if you don't listen to this experiment through headphones, then the effect doesn't work. You need to be listening through headphones, and we make that very clear in our instructions. We repeatedly say, put on your headphones now. The second set of instructions here just tells people to pay attention to the men or the women, and gives them a bit more of a setting for the audio scene. But then this bit is almost exactly what we created beforehand. I've added a little rich text here saying remember to pay attention to the women's voices. I also added this other check to say, did you hear the women on the left or the right? Again, this will help us identify if people are listening through headphones, and we could perhaps use this as an exclusion criteria later on. Then it's exactly what we did before. So did you hear anything unusual, yes or no? And we use that branching rule so that if they say no, it will jump to the next question. But if they say yes, it jumps to this screen, which is a text box where you can write down what you heard that was unusual. After I'd created this, I just used copy and paste, as I said in the last tutorial, to make the control condition. The last thing I did was I put in a debrief at the end. And this debrief explains the concept of the experiment, what we were looking for. It also has a little shortened audio clip of the man saying, I'm a gorilla. We just extracted that little bit so they could hear that, and that can be played up to 10 times. So once I'd created this experiment, and I was happy with it, you can just go up here to clone, and then you give it a new name, and then once I did that, I would just have to make a couple small edits. I would just have to change in the instructions screen whether they listen to men or women, and if I wanted as well on the answers here, because I've preloaded the answers so Gorilla will automatically know if it's correct or not, I can change left and right in the active response. I also obviously need to change the audio file depending on which one of the 2 files I want to use. As I said though, that's just one way of going about this. There are other ways that you could build this as well using spreadsheets or manipulations. The other things we have to include as well is a consent form, and the consent form actually is the generic consent form that is freely available on Gorilla. You can see it's nothing too complicated, it just asks you to consent to these 3 items. And in order to get that, you can just go to Create, Questionnaire, Clone Existing, and if you look down here, we've got all of Gorilla samples available to you. So you can always take something that's very similar perhaps to what you want, and use that as a jumping off point. In my case, I went to classic questionnaires, and I just took the generic consent form. I also took the generic demographics form, but made a little alteration to it as well. We didn't want the contact information, so I deleted the bits of contact information. I also wanted to add in a little thing here for exclusion criteria. Do you have any hearing difficulties in your left or right ear? Now, obviously, if somebody has, especially if they have hearing in one ear and not the other, then that could obviously be a problem for our experiment, and it could bias the results. So it's important that we know that. And you can either just have that information in your questionnaire, or if you wanted, you could use what here we could say write embedded data, and I called this hearing. And what I'll show you in a second is that you could use that answer as a branching rule. So either the person goes on with the experiment, or the participant gets taken to the finish and said, thank you for participating, however, you aren't able to do this experiment. So let's just build the experiment now. And this part is nice and easy. I'm just going to call this experiment demo. And we always start with this. We always have a start node and a finish node. We go to edit. And once we edit, we have this bar up here. And this is where we can add our different node types. So let's add our consent. And this part I always find quite satisfying. I think people quite like it. You take the white dot, click on that, and drag along to your next box. So now start, instead of going to finish, start goes to generic consent. Next thing we need is our demographics questionnaire, and we drag down to make that connection. Obviously then we have our task, so we've got men on the left, men on the right, women on the left, and women on the right. Our 4 versions of the task, which I'm just going to drag over here. And then we drag our arrows here to the finish. So I mentioned that branching rule, and you can see that here. And this is a branch node, and in that branch node what you can do is you can set a group, so we can say something like hearing, and the property is also called hearing. That's what the response was called in our questionnaire. So we say if hearing equals yes, which will be our default setting, then the next group we can call no hearing, and here we just say hearing equals no. And those are our 2 branches. And what we would then do is our no hearing branch would go to a new finish node, like so, and the hearing branch would then go to these experiments here. So I didn't actually include that in the final study, so I'm just going to click remove and get rid of that. But I just wanted to show you that as an option. We did our data collection using Prolific, so that meant that we could set that as a criteria in Prolific rather than setting it as a criteria in Gorilla. So I'm now going to set a randomizer, because once participants have done the questionnaires, we want to randomly assign them to one of the 4 conditions. So we're going to need 4 groups, and we can call them ML, MR, WL, WR, and the ratio I'm setting that to be 2. And what this means is that for every 8 participants, Gorilla will make sure that 2 of them will be randomly allocated to ML, 2 of them will be randomly allocated to MR, 2 to WL, and 2 to WR. And here we go. And now we just drag this to here. And there we go. We've completed our experiment. And under utilities, if you want, you can update all nodes to check that you're using the most recent versions of any tasks and questionnaires. It also has a little check for errors function, which will tell you if there's a mistake in the way the code works. You can, and I strongly recommend this, before you actually send your experiment out into the world, do preview experiment just to check that it all works as you expect it to. Assuming you're happy with it, we can just commit this version. And now that we're happy with that, we can go to recruitment. And here we'll set our recruitment target. You'll remember from this paper, they had a recruitment target of 45. I'm just going to go for 50, and you'll click confirm, and you'll have 50 tokens in your account. Then we choose which recruitment policy we want to use. So the most basic recruitment policy is a simple link, which means you just put that URL online, and anyone can click that link and do your experiment. The other option as well is supervised, so if you want to maybe have a bit more control over it, you can set up ID codes. So people will click the link, but they also have to have an ID code in order to enter the site. You can do that as well through email, which again, same idea, it gives people ID codes. And there are different recruitment services that work very nicely with Gorilla. So we can, for example, use Prolific, MTurk, Sonar, Qualtrics. Any third-party recruitment agency can be integrated with Gorilla. Now, it's a good idea as well to set time limits, a little bit longer than you think you need. In the paper, they said this experiment should take 10 minutes. I think when I looked at the data, most people took 5. I actually set a time limit of 15 minutes, just to make sure that there was enough time, but it automatically rejects anyone now who takes more than 15 minutes, so you don't lose those tokens. The last bit as well is just some requirements. Let's say, for example, you only want people to do this on a computer, you don't want them using phones or iPads. You can also select which browser you want them to use. You can limit by location, maybe you only want people who are UK residents to do this. You can also limit by connection speed and setting a minimum connection that people could use. Once all of this has been set up, your experiment can go online and you're ready to go. And you'll start to see the participants rolling in, and the last thing you'll see at the end here is what's called a consort style graph. Or I'm not sure actually what the word is for that, or a consort style illustration, workflow maybe. And what this will do is it will tell you how many people entered each one of the nodes, and it will tell you how many people went on to the next stage and how many people were rejected in this node. And this can be incredibly important because if you notice that there is a very high attrition rate in one of your nodes, it can mean one of two things. It can mean that there's something wrong in the way that task is set up, or it can mean there's something conceptually about that task. So something that's too difficult perhaps, maybe, there's something participants don't understand in that node. And you need to go back and look over it and update it and try and figure out why there's such high attrition in one aspect of the task. Once your data collection is done, or you want to have a look at your data, we go to Manage Experimental Data, and we choose what format we want it to come in. I use CSV, which is a comma-separated value text file. And yeah, you can select your time frame if you only want to get people from today, or you just want all the data in one place. Long form and short form. Long form basically means that you have, for every task element, is a row. Short form works for questionnaires, and that means that each row is a participant, and each column, you'd have a column for gender, a column for age, things like that. Unfortunately, because of the variability in the way people create tasks, we can't have short form task data. But when you go to my advanced analysis section, I'm going to show you how to write a very simple R script that is going to take the long form data and turn it into short form data. And with that, we're going to download this data set, and the next video is going to show you how to extract the data and analyze it.